Good morning. Welcome to the first in a series of interviews with people involved with helping to protect, preserve, restore, and promote knowledge of California's historic gardens and landscapes. I'm David Laws. I'm a member of the California Garden and History Society and Landscape History Society, and today I'll be talking with Christy O'Hara about her life and career in landscape architecture. Christy is a professor at California Polytechnic State University, better known in the state as Cal Poly, located in San Luis Obispo, California, and a recent president of CGLHS. She is talking to us today from her home in the Golden Hills of Atascadero. Let's meet Christy O'Hara. Good morning, Christy. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, good morning. Good to see you.
Christy, let's start off at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your childhood and family, where you were born and where you were raised.
So I was born in Portland, Oregon in 1965. My parents were both Oregonians, went to University of Oregon, which is where they met. And one interesting fact was that my parents and I were both born at the same, or all born at the same hospital by the same doctor. And he came out of retirement because he said he wanted to deliver a child of the children he delivered. So that was kind of an interesting beginning. And I think my parents had aspirations to stay in Oregon, but my father had been an Olympian in the 1960s Olympics in Rome as a decathlete. And when he, after the Olympics in college, he decided to go into the Air Force and was still extremely athletic at that point. And they ended up having him become the assistant track coach at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. So he moved in 1968 to Colorado, which is for the most part where I grew up. First in Colorado Springs in a little town called Palmer Lake. And then when my father became an attorney in 1973, we moved up to Denver and for the most part stayed there. My parents did have this one aspiration to go back to and be near their parents when I was in high school. So we moved for a year and a half back to Portland, and then they changed their mind and back to Denver. And those moves and increasing number of children in my family, there's 6 children, caused me to go to 5 high schools, which turned out to be fine. Probably had a crazy looking transcript, but it was a good challenge. And I had friends at all of the high schools, so that made it a lot easier.
What number were you in the family, Christy?
I'm the oldest, so a sister and 4 brothers, with my youngest brothers being 15 years younger than me. So a big age gap between us.
As a family, were you close? Did you do lots of things together, or did everybody go their own way?
When we were all at home, yes, we did. We all were a close family. I went to college when my youngest brothers, who are twins, were only 3. And when I came back one time on a break, they asked if I was their aunt, because I didn't really grow up with them. In fact, they're only 10 years older than my oldest child. So they're closer in age to my children than I am to them. So it's a big gap. But now we're really all spread out across the world. I have a brother that moved to Sweden 20 years ago.
Interesting.
And 2 brothers that were in the military. So they've moved a lot. So it's harder to find each other these days.
Must have been challenging going to all those schools, making friends, knowing new teachers. So how did you enjoy school? What were your favorite subjects?
Yeah, I loved school. I loved math. I loved art. I was an avid reader, constantly read. I loved reading everything that my parents were reading. My dad loved historical fiction, so I'd read all of his books and his spy books and his James Bond books and all my mom's Harlequin romances and all those books she was reading.
Avid reader.
But I loved everything, every subject. I've never gotten bored of anything I was reading.
Interesting. Do you remember any particular influences, either at school, in the family, or neighbors, that you think helped you take a trajectory in your career?
One of my favorite teachers was Mrs. Obana, and she was a math teacher in 8th grade. And she allowed a couple of us to go ahead in math. That we thought that the 8th grade math was pretty simple, and we ended up finishing that 8th grade math by Christmas time, and then did 9th grade math from January to June. And so I think having this teacher see that you had this potential and that you really wanted to learn more was a great thing. I had a lot of terrific teachers in high school, that also were really supportive and encouraging to take the hardest classes you could, which is what I did. When I was in high school, we had a chance to go between two different high schools during a break. So you could go to one high school for some of your classes. Like I wanted to take a geology class at one high school, and then at break, I could go to the other high school that was about 3 miles away and take other classes with different teachers. So that was a great opportunity to be able to go to two high schools in a given day.
That's unique. How about college? How did you make the choice of college, and where did you go?
So when I was in high school, I originally wanted to go to Harvard, and my parents had friends that went there, and I went to visit during high school and talked to one of the advisors there. But when it came down to which schools to apply to, I really felt as a Western person growing up for the most part in Colorado, and decided to apply to University of Colorado, Westmont College in Santa Barbara, and Stanford, which I didn't think I'd ever get into. I had a really strong GPA, but it was just really competitive. My particular year only had 1,400 students, so it was one of the smaller classes that year. So that was really wonderful. It was a great opportunity to be there. Loved every minute, except for finals.
And at Stanford, what courses do you study?
I had originally thought I would go into medicine, and had thought about being an obstetrician for many, many years. But once I started taking the science classes, I just did terribly and knew that that wasn't really my direction. I always was going to be an English major anyway, so that wasn't changing my major. But what I did have the opportunity to do at Stanford was create my own major, which they allow you to do if has some kind of cohesion, and also is all upper division courses. So you create really the curriculum for what you want to study. Granted, there's a lot of GEs that you had to take that were required, but I ended up taking an art history class my freshman year that I loved. And so I thought about a way that I could combine English and art history together, with the theme being that artists within the same time period try to create modernity the same way. They're just expressing it through different media. So that I would take classes such as 19th century American Lit with 19th century American painting, and watch how the two groups of artists responded to history, and then how it affected their own art form. For example, Picasso's Cubism, he was breaking up the human figure, but you knew it was, a face, even though the eyes are like this far apart. And at the same time, Gertrude Stein is writing poetry of a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, where you don't have a verb or any kind of syntax, but you know what she means. And so looking at these two groups of artists was this really fascinating interdisciplinary study that I think has helped me in terms of what I do now with interpreting history and art together.
Any thoughts about where you wanted your career to go at that point in your life?
Well, I told my dad that I wanted to be paid to read and write. And he said, good luck. And I thought an academic career would be something that would be really fun, because I thought it would be hard. It would be challenging. I would get to stay in school every day, I loved school. I was never one of those children that didn't want to go. So my plan was to get out and get some kind of a graduate degree. I wasn't sure what I wanted to study, because with that, my own major, I didn't really have an art history degree. So it would have been challenging to get into a master's and PhD program without a lot of extra courses that I hadn't taken. But that was the plan.
And so you graduated in 1987?
I did. I actually finished about 6 months early. And my parents told me they didn't expect me to go to Stanford either. And they told me to save some money for the rest of the children. So they wanted me to finish in 3 years. So I took 20 to 25 units a quarter for 2 years. Wow. To do that. So I finished actually at Christmas. And the next thing I decided to do, I didn't think my parents would be really supportive, is to become a flight attendant. So in calling home, I'm like, I've decided to become a flight attendant. because I wanted to travel for free and I'd be working, and they were completely supportive. So I ended up
Wow.
starting to fly for Delta Airlines in March of '87.
Okay.
And I would have, my own peers, I'm taking tickets in the day, and I got to the San Francisco airport and they're like, "What are you doing here?" You're like, "You're supposed to be in class." And I'm like, "I'm already done and working." So finishing early was a bummer because I'd gotten into a graduate program at Stanford, but my parents were like, "Nope, we paid for undergrad. That's all we're doing."
Okay. And then, so what did you do for the next few years? You were worked for the airline for a while?
I did. I moved a lot. I got based initially in Cincinnati, and then I moved to Salt Lake City so I could ski for the winter.
Mm-hmm.
It's easy drive up to the mountains, like a 1 hour drive from downtown Salt Lake. And then I moved to Los Angeles. My then 4 years of boyfriend, Patrick, had moved from Stanford to Los Angeles. And so I joined him there and told him that we had to get married because no Bronco fan lives in Los Angeles. So we got married soon after I moved.
Okay.
And then I quit working for Delta and started working for the LA County Museum of Art as a curatorial assistant in 20th century art,
Okay.
which was really interesting. I worked there for another year and a half until my daughter was about 6 months old.
And then in '95, I see you started your own landscaping business.
I did.
How did that start and what were you doing?
So Patrick and I bought a house in 1989 in Torrance, and a tiny house with a really large backyard. And I did what anyone who doesn't know anything about landscape does, and they put a 3-foot planting around the edges of the yard and fill the rest of it with grass. But what I realized as I fell in love with plants and with landscape design was that all of the same things I'd been taught about art in terms of form and color and repetition was the same. Those same applications applied to this new art form that I found to be particularly challenging because it's really hard to control nature. It's not like a building where you can design it as you want and it'll stay put. This was constantly changing. And
Yeah.
so by the time we moved 8 years later, the beds were about 20 feet wide. So huge amount of planting. And friends of mine who were interior designers had asked if I would design the landscapes for their home. And I didn't know how to draw, and I didn't know how to draw a planting plan. I didn't know what it was supposed to look like. So I took classes at UCLA, in the extension program for a year. I actually didn't even know what landscape architecture was. I thought it was garden design, not, grading and drainage and other things. And after a year there, I transferred to Cal Poly Pomona to their master's program, and was a master's in landscape architecture is 3 years long. So it's a long program, and you end up with a professional degree, which is partly why it's so long. But I was there for a year and a half, and at the time, my children were 2 and 4, and it just became too stressful to have this practice, to be in graduate school. Plus, it was taking me an hour and a half or so each drive to get out there and come back. So I ended up stopping my master's until I had 2 more children. So by then I had 4, and then went to University of Washington, which is where I had wanted to go all along, because I wanted to study with David Streatfield, who was up there, who's the California landscape historian.
Sure. Did the family move up, or did
I went with
Patrick
my 4?
look after you?
No, I went with my 4 kids, and my husband commuted on the weekends for 2 years.
Wow.
I convinced one of the kids' favorite babysitters to stop out of junior college for a year and come with me. So she did, and so there was some kind of continuity. And so she lived with me in Seattle, and I was up there by myself the second year that I was there, because I was David's TA in his history classes. And the second year I was on my own. That was really challenging. But yeah, and the children were 1, 3, 7, and 9 when I moved. So I had 2 toddlers and 2 in grade school. But I finished top of my class there, so it ended up all working out.
Good for you. And so you graduated in 2002 from University of Washington with a master's in landscape architecture and a concentration in history. So what did you do after that? What was the next move?
So I had been home for a long time because I wanted to be home with my children when they were small. And that's why I went back when Michael was one. I couldn't wait any longer because this academic career that I wanted to have. I was now 35 years old and time to get going. So I convinced Patrick. Patrick's like, I was going to go get a PhD. I was like, oh, let me stop at Berkeley on the way back. Because I really wasn't a Los Angeles person. And I was kind of there against my will for 11 years. So I said, I'm going to do the PhD on the way home. And then I promise I'll be done. And that's when he said, where are you willing to live? And I said, you know, where I want to live is in San Luis Obispo and try to get a job at Cal Poly. His parents had moved to Cambria in the late 80s, and we'd driven there from Los Angeles. We're like, where in the world is Cambria? And going up to the Central Coast, it was one of the most beautiful places, you know, that I'd ever seen. And I've traveled a lot between my flight attendant gig and my family traveled a lot. So I said, this is where I want to be. This is the most beautiful place that I've seen. And so I was really fortunate when I got up here that I didn't get a job with Cal Poly right away. And in fact, I was turned down because I hadn't finished my master's until I actually finished it that summer in 2002. And then I ended up doing landscape design again, which wasn't my plan, but for an English professor whose wife worked with my husband. And it just so happened he was best friends with one of the faculty in landscape architecture. And his friends said to him, one of the lecturers decided not to come off of maternity leave. And where am I going to find someone ready to go in 3 weeks? And he said, I know someone, you know, and so I was like, boom, got the lecturing position in 2003.
Okay. And then what was, it's the College of Architecture, Environmental Design, Landscape Architecture Department, obviously. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about the succession of roles you have had at Cal Poly. You've assistant professor, associate professor, and finally professor.
Yeah, I started as a lecturer and I lectured for 3 years. And then it was always this kind of late to tell you whether you're going to be teaching. It's really hard to make any decisions when they don't tell you if you're going to have a position until a month before and you need to be working. So I ended up quitting and going to design build for the next 2 years with a company in Atascadero called Madrone Landscapes, where I did all their design. And when a tenure track position came up 2 years later, I applied. And that's when I got a tenure track position that time. So that was in 2008, where I started as an assistant, moved to associate. And then once I had tenure, I decided actually the stars had to align. I needed to get tenure. I was applying to a PhD program because I really, really wanted to get that PhD because I thought it would be really fun. And I had all this research that I had developed on the Olmsted brothers, that here was this opportunity to not only do a dissertation with that information, but write a book. And so I applied for a PhD program, tenure, and a sabbatical and got all three. So I ended up going to University of Edinburgh because two friends of mine who were also academics went there and studied there. And plus it was a chance to live in Europe, which was always on my bucket list to do too. I had done this really carefully because I wanted to make sure that our third daughter started college and our youngest had a driver's license. So my husband wouldn't have to drive him around. So I was trying to be very strategic that I didn't want to burden him too much, my absence. So I moved to Scotland in, when did I go? 2014.
2014, yes.
Yeah.
Here. Yeah.
And part of that, the stream of living there, plus I can only speak one language. So I was writing in English, which really helped.
But you're in Scotland. They speak a totally different language there. I lived there for two years in Edinburgh, so I know well.
But at least I could write at an academic level
there you go.
in my own language, unlike a lot of my peers. And it was just an amazing place to live. It was so beautiful. I'd never been to Scotland before.
Yeah.
Everyone always goes, my husband's family's from Ireland and our children all have Irish citizenship. So we've been to Ireland plenty of times and England plenty of times. But to go up to the Highlands and to live in that, just an amazing historical place.
Landscape design is so different there from anything you would have known on the West Coast. I mean,
but
I remember I was in Edinburgh and I laid in bed late one day and I missed the whole summer. So it's different.
Yes, it is. But I wasn't studying Scotland I was studying America. And so
Yes. Okay.
that topic that I brought with me, you can study anything you want. And I said I had spent 4 years getting the research ready because I needed to digitize all the letters and all the correspondence and the plans for 200 plus projects that the Olmsted brothers had designed or consulted on in California. So it took me 4 years to do that. But I finally had the data and was ready to read it all. But I was reading it in this really beautiful place.
Good for you. And so you finally completed your PhD fairly recently, right?
In 2018 was when I graduated.
Yep.
And I think that helped me get promoted to full professor, which,
okay,
because you don't usually, what Edinburgh thought I was doing, my advisors knew what I was doing, was coming back to teach again. So I would live in Scotland in the falls and take a leave from Cal Poly. But then winter, spring, I would take a leave of absence, of residence, I should say, from Edinburgh, because my resources that I needed were all at American Archives. But I was also teaching full time, which is usually a 50-hour work week. It's pretty typical, on top of like another 20 hours of working on my dissertation. So a lot of 70-hour work weeks in order to do both and finish on time.
Talk to me about the life of a professor in landscape architecture in modern day in Cal Poly. What do you do?
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. I mean, the classes are really long. We have design studios that are 4 hours long, 3 times a week. So we're with our students all the time. Right now, I've got 20 hours of class because of these really long days. But there's usually, aside from the pandemic, usually we are on field trips. I had an opportunity in 2010 to take students abroad for 5 weeks. So I met them in Marseille, France, and we would move every week. And I was trying to teach them how do places in the Mediterranean design with low water and no lawns and no real English overlay that we have in the United States. So we're looking at parks that didn't have grass and things like that. What were some things that we could take away? And that was just an amazing opportunity to be with 14 students for a month and a half in Europe, traveling and seeing things every day. I think as an academic too, we've got some nice holidays. We've got summers where we don't have class. So it's an unusual job, and it's completely autonomous. You just need to be in your class when you have class and at the meetings you're supposed to attend. But how you organize your courses is really up to you. And that kind of independence, that's very different from any other kind of job. I know that there's tension between sometimes administration and faculty because they have to account for all their sick leave and where are they and are they there from 8 to 5. That we don't ever have that. There's just an assumption they're going to be there. But I love that independence, and it enabled me to be able to help with my children and have this lifestyle of working from home and taking care of a big family while also being a professor.
Well planned. You must have met some interesting people along the way. Any personalities stand out in your mind?
Well, as I said, David Streatfield has been a huge influence on my career. I saw him at the Nixon Library giving a lecture soon after his book came out on Eden and California landscapes and history. And I didn't really know there's existed such a thing as landscape history. But coming, this like love of landscape architecture, love of art history, seemed like it's a wonderful blend. And so I met him, and I aspired to somehow study with him. And when I finally did go up to Seattle, he gave me so much of his time and attention and support, and continued to write letters for me that I needed to get academic positions, and he continues to be a friend. So he was great. I think also that my peers in Edinburgh were amazing, to have friends from Hong Kong, from Japan, from Greece, from Colombia, South America, and to see all these different lives and lifestyles and foods and accents, and it's have this really international group of friends, which I really appreciated since it's pretty provincial where I live.
My background is tech, and there are not a lot of females at the higher level in tech. In landscape design and architecture, there do seem to be some fairly well-known women. Have you met many of those, learned from them?
I've met them. We have these wonderful lecture series, like Andrea Cochran is one of my favorite landscape architects, has an office in the Bay Area. So you go see them lecture, and then you go out for dinner. Peter Walker, who is a prominent landscape architect at the World Trade Center Memorial, among a million projects, an opportunity to go have dinner with him and talk to him, with 5 other people. Those have been some really awesome experiences that I don't think I would have normally had if I wasn't an academic that had them there. So yeah, I mean, yeah, the people that have come, that's been really mind blowing to be able to I one time I went to this ESLA conference a couple years ago in San Diego, and I'm sitting in on a lecture, and I look over to my left, like 8 feet away is James Corner, who designed the High Line. And I was totally starstruck. I was just like, oh my goodness, Walter Hood was there too. It's like all my favorite people. Maybe only landscape architects would recognize these people, but for me, I was starstruck.
These are the rock stars of landscape architecture.
Exactly.
Along with all the good times, I'm sure there have been some disappointments and challenges along the way. Are there any that stand out in mind, and how did you overcome them?
I didn't get my teaching position without applying 3 times. Mm-hmm. So I was disappointed multiple times. There also was a failed search, that while I was there in 2006, where they were looking for someone to teach landscape history, which was perfect for me. Like, I thought this was written for me. And they ended up choosing no one. So that was pretty disappointing, that there was a lot of issues in that hiring. But I was like, this should have been something that if my colleagues really wanted me here, that I would have been, considered. But no, didn't happen. And so it wasn't until that 3rd application to a tenured position, because I really didn't want to stay as a lecturer and be adjunct my whole life.
You've written a lot of papers, participated in a lot of conferences, which is, out of all those, if you just had to pick one to talk about, what would be the one you'd like people to remember you for?
I don't know if there's this one certain one. I think that the papers that have received the most recognition have been from the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians and also Landscape Journal, which are 2 prominent academic journals in my field. And that has been wonderful to see those get quoted in other people's books. I feel like when other academics are quoting you, that you're getting read. So that's exciting to see.
Mm-hmm. Tell me about the process of researching one of these topics. How do you go about it? Where do you start? How do you take notes? How do you structure the whole event?
Most of my research has been primary because there is not a lot written about the Olmsted brothers, especially in California. They're more well known on the East Coast for Boston and other cities like that. So what I ended up doing was reading all their correspondence for their California practice, and then interpreting that as a landscape architect, which is different than if you were, say, an architectural historian in terms of understanding a grading plan, or is this a drought tolerant planting plan? The lens that I read their work through is that of a landscape architect. Like, what is their intention with this design? How are they understanding and managing stormwater? How are they working with the natural environment? So I usually have that kind of this bias when I'm starting of what I'm looking for, and then see if it's there. Is it written in their own language, in their own words? And is it also in the drawings and in the plans? What are they doing? So I approach it that way. I've always been in my own practice focused on sustainability, reduction of water, reduction of lawns, things like that I think are not appropriate for where we live. And then, so that I think is one thing that I look to in this firm is, were they doing similar things in their time period in the context of technology from that era?
And how do you pull that all together in the end?
A really good outline.
Okay.
Starting, I'm still trying to get a publisher for my book, which is a lot of my dissertation, which was a kind of a chronology of the firm working in California in the Bay Area with Lakeshore Highlands and St. Francis Wood, where they weren't really understanding this weather yet. They didn't think they could have these steep grades because there was no snow here. When the developer's like, we'll be fine, this really steep 15%, grade on the road.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand the plants yet. But as they moved into the 20s and then it opened a firm here in Olmsted Junior living here, it was the development of my dissertation takes each kind of case study of Palos Verdes into the parkway designs that they did that managed stormwater, into the state park system with the management of open space, and then looking broadly at a watershed management plan, which was the LA park system that kind of aggregated the other parts of this narrative and the story and the characters, kind of builds through the whole thing so that you see the influencers, the ideas, and how those changed within context of Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s.
Are there a couple of exemplars of their work that you would say, hey, go to look at these two places? They'll show you what they were really all about.
Definitely the Malaga Cove neighborhoods of Palos Verdes. Those were designed per their plan. Unfortunately, that was all they had gotten done by 1930 and the Depression begins. So all the brakes are really put on construction through parts of the 30s, and other developers then developed other aspects of Palos Verdes. So it doesn't really have the same feel to me. The 40s don't and the 50s don't, from what the Olmsteds were doing. And you're not going to find things like storm drains in that part of Malaga Cove. They're actually managing stormwater with their landscape design so that the runoff goes into the plants. It follows natural ravines. So that particular place would be one in California that I would go visit. But I would also thank them for the California State Park System, Olmsted Junior, saving all of these pristine places. He was doing it. He was catching some of the places like the redwoods that were being completely destroyed by timbering, cutting down these large 1,000-year-old oaks. I mean, not oaks, redwoods to make furniture and other things. So he wanted to save places like that from being ruined. But he also saved places in the deserts and by the ocean, and set up this legacy that today we have the largest state park system in the country.
Yeah. There's a couple of Olmsted streets here in Monterey. I know he designed the memory guard behind the Pacific House. So the name is even familiar to a few folks around here that know nothing about what an Olmsted is.
And I'm drawing a blank now on the three sisters that he worked with. They were, their father had a rancho in Monterey. And
I think they were the children of David Jacks. That was the big landowner
sisters.
around here.
So the Jack sisters end up hiring Olmsted Jr. to come lay out subdivisions, and he did a park system design for Monterey.
Okay, that's
so they did that's why you see that Olmsted street for the work that he did. Do you know how the Jack sisters got all their money? The dad was a dairy farmer.
Well, he was a huge landowner, and certainly he is claimed to have stolen the secret of the Monterey Jack cheese, but I'm not sure that he actually ever was in the production of cheese, but that's the local legend.
Like, Monterey Jacks, I didn't know, like the Jack family in Monterey, and I think that's how they got a lot of their money too, is maybe from the cheese.
So do you have any time outside of work, Christy? How do you spend your time? What do you enjoy doing?
Well, aside from this year where I've been in this house for almost a year, we usually travel a lot. We had plans to be in Portugal. My son was abroad last spring, so we were going to go to Portugal and travel and then go see him. He was living in Marseille at the time, or Aix-en-Provence is where he was living. So we usually travel a lot. We like to camp and be outside. I like to go up into the mountains and just, love the outdoors. And we also normally go to a lot of live music events. which like everything that we usually do has the brakes on it. But we also live in a really beautiful place,
Yeah.
that going to the beach, we're only 15 minutes away. So I take a lot of long walks at the beach and spend a lot of time outside gardening and doing other things. We've got acreage, so we've got a lot of room to spread out where we live here. But I think travel would be the thing that I've missed the most during this pandemic.
And you spent what, either 2 or 4 years as president of CGLHS.
Mhm.
Why did you decide to do that?
I was president for 3 years. Partly, I was asked, which is why I did it. I thought that it would be a challenge, that it would be good as an academic to have the state leadership. So those were all parts. Plus, I'd been part of the organization for a long time. I was the treasurer for 4 years. I'd been on the board since 2008. So I think one of my favorite parts is the people that you get to meet. The interesting board members, the interesting members in our organization, and the conferences. I love all the educational events that we have. There's so much to be learned from each of them. So all of those things are, and Eden too, is what has drawn me to this organization in the first place.
Good, good. How about looking forward? What are your plans for the next few years once the world returns to normal, if ever?
Well, I'm trying to get 2 books published. One is my own, which is the dissertation kind of revisited. And then another one that I'm working as the editor on, one called Essential Eden, where I've got a committee. I read through 2,000 pages of Eden's from the very beginning of the journal when it started as a newsletter, and selected the best articles that I thought were written over the course of 20 years. So that's the next thing, that I have some more time, that we can focus on this and find the right publisher for that book, and also gets a photographer to reshoot some of these places that we had only tiny little black and whites, when it was first published, to have this really lush book that we want to sell and publish.
Good. Well, I look forward to seeing that.
Me too.
Looking forward to the students that you work with, and for younger people thinking of embarking on a career in landscape architecture, what advice would you give them?
I would say, even within landscape architecture, to craft the kind of practice you want to have. There are not usually job offerings for landscape historians. It's not a typical profession. Architectural historians, yes, but I think if that's really what you want to do, the way I was able to get a lot of work was to do work pro bono, doing writing for free for groups that needed help, and to kind of develop the career that I wanted. Mm-hmm. So I would say, cobble together all your favorite things and craft the kind of career for what you want to do. And that way you'll really love what you do, because it encompasses all these other things that are of interest. So I would say, go for it and just choose what facet of landscape architecture really interests you.
Okay, well, I think we've covered most of the outline of a very busy career here, Christy. Do you have anything else that you'd like to mention that perhaps we glossed over during the talk?
I would also say to women that I'm a very small number of women that are academics that have a large family, and I would say that you can do it. I think you can have a family and a career and balance it. Sometimes you have to wait a little bit, like I did, be home for a while. But I encourage people to have, I guess you could have everything, as long as you've got enough energy.
And choose a very understanding partner.
I got very lucky in that regard, for someone that understood the importance of academic mentorship. Sure. And was supportive of me leaving because of how that would help me in my career.
Good. Well, I've enjoyed talking with you, Christy. I believe that Janet is listening today. And Janet, do you have any question that you'd like to ask Christy at this point?
Yeah, I'm curious, Christy, and I have to say this has been really a delightful conversation between the two of you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I've learned such a lot. I'm just curious how going forward right now in time of COVID, how this has affected your teaching profession and your personal life.
I think it's very difficult to teach this way, and I admire people that have figured out how to teach virtual classes. My landscape history class typically has 150 to 200 students in it. And I found that it was impossible to do live lectures and record it and see the chat and get people back into the classroom who had lost their internet. And ultimately, I ended up, the best solution was to pre-record them all. But then I had to go back and edit all the audio files because Zoom doesn't know how to spell LA and Olmsted, and Thomas Church has got a small c. So it was fixing all these lectures that normally I would give live and never have to do extra work like this. Plus, it's really challenging. I'm teaching a class right now with construction documents to receive only digital files and to redline grading plans and other plans that normally I'd have a hard copy in order to grade. The students also feel isolated from each other. You know, I put them into breakout rooms so they can be in smaller groups and see their friends. But normally, so much learning goes on when I leave school. They're there, you know, they teach each other, they work together, they stay up all night. And so I think that that's been really hard for them too, is just not having that experience with each other. So I look forward to this pandemic being over and us being back to a normal kind of seeing each other. I'm a people person. I don't like being by myself at home talking to people this way all the time. So I look forward to being with them again and being on campus, which is always a really dynamic atmosphere, being on a university campus. So I think what we'll take away is maybe pre-recording some lectures so that students don't have to come on campus if you want to have field trips, trying to figure out what were the best things that came out of this and keep those. But I think person to person teaching is what I prefer. And I miss my students and seeing them.
You know, I can well imagine that. And I really would have missed an awful lot by not having the experience of the other students when I was in school. And that was an important factor for sure. Yeah. David, do you have any additional thoughts?
I don't think so, Janet. Thank you for taking the time for recording this today. And hopefully, if this proves to be popular, we can talk to many more people in this business. There's lots of movers and shakers we'd all like to know more about.
Yeah, there certainly are. So thank you
right.
so much for this opportunity.
Absolutely. I think it's just been a wonderful experience. This has been our first foray into recording interviews with luminaries in the field of landscape and its related professions. And I think this is an excellent start. Watch for more interviews on our website as we prepare them. And you can learn more about the California Garden and Landscape History Society at cglhs.org. Please join us and learn more about our events, our annual meetings, our quarterly journal called Eden. And this year, 2021, our regular membership is $50, and that allows you access to our upcoming lecture series. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm
Thank
going
you,
to
Janet.
end the meeting.
Okay.